Hello, my name's Elaine and I'm a volunteer with Micah, and I'm going to do a salsa recipe demonstration. Now first I have to tell you I have never made salsa at home. I have bought fresh made salsa at various stores around Ottawa and also bottled, and I do prefer the fresh salsa. So in agreeing to do this recipe demonstration for the website under the Caregivers Cafe program, I did some research on the internet, and there are scads of recipes. However, I came across one which is called the Best Homemade Salsa Recipe, and I couldn't resist that one. That can be found at a website called aspicyperspective.com. It's a website that does have all different spicy recipes for every food imaginable. And it's the creation of a woman called Summer Collier. She's a professional food writer, recipe developer, etc., and so on. Anyway, she's graciously agreed to let me use this recipe. The other two things that attracted me to this one is that you can store it up to 10 to 12 days in your fridge in an airtight sealed container, or you can freeze it for up to 4 months in an airtight container as well, then wrap it in tin foil and put it in your freezer. So I have found that fresh salsa that's store-bought doesn't have a shelf life or a fridge life of 10 to 12 days. So I thought this was very interesting. And the second thing is that all of the comment section had various people saying that they didn't like this cumin, for example, in their salsa, or they preferred not to have onions in their salsa, or they preferred not to have coriander and so on. So I thought that we might do some sort of combination and do some testing along the way to see what preferences are. So that's the introduction, and so let's start. Okay, so the ingredients for this salsa, and as I mentioned, I did some research on the internet, and there's lots of recipes have different ingredients. But basically you've got your tomatoes. So this recipe calls for 4 tomatoes. You can do Roma tomatoes, or you can do on the vine or beefsteak. It calls for 1 red onion, 3 garlic cloves, 3 jalapeno chilies, which I did not use 3, I used 1.5 in mine. Let's see, 1/3 cup of cilantro, 3 tablespoons of fresh lime, 2 to 3 teaspoons of coriander, 2 to 3 teaspoons of sugar if needed, and 1.5 teaspoons of salt. It then also calls for, in order to enrich the salsa, it calls for canned tomatoes. And Summer Collier recommends that you use the San Marzano tomatoes, which are, I do know from using them myself, that they do taste good, very good, and I prefer them. However, I couldn't find crushed ones in the size needed, so I'm going to use actually these finely chopped tomatoes from Italy. I'm hoping they're the same. And then I also came across in the store in hunting for ingredients that there's these crushed heirloom tomatoes. And I'll talk a little bit about this a little bit more when we get to the part of the recipe that calls for adding the canned tomatoes. And then also, along with the canned tomatoes at the end, chopped green chilies. And her recipe calls for your choice of mild, medium, or hot. It's an American website. All I could find in the stores in Ottawa was just this 1 can. So I hope these are mild, but I am going to modify the size of the ingredients. So, okay, now let's get into the prep. Okay, so I'm just finishing up the last of the tomatoes. I chopped them up. I used a combination of vine tomatoes and Romas, simply because that's what I had on hand. Never having made this before, I'm interested in seeing what the difference is on different tomatoes as I use it over the time period, over the months to come. Now, I've also separated my mixture into 2 sizes. It made about 4 cups. So this is 2 cups and a bit, and this is a little bit under 2 cups and so on, because I'm going to test as I go, because I know I like certain ingredients, I'm not sure about others. So I have put in the 4 ripe tomatoes, 1 red onion, 1.5 garlic cloves. No, I did do 3 garlic cloves, sorry. I put in 1.5 jalapeno chili, 1/3 cup of cilantro because I like it, some people don't, and I also put in the fresh lime juice because I know that freshens things up, so I would like that. So we're halfway through here. What the recipe on the website, A Spicy Perspective, calls for is to put everything into a food processor, except for your tomatoes and your green chilies at the end, and cut them up that way. And it's really quick. Obviously, it's a smooth salsa with a little bit of chunks in it and so on. I don't have a food processor, so that's why I used a mini chopper like this, and I just basically used the chop function and pulsed it to get the cutting done. The website does say, though, that you can also use a high-speed blender if you have one, but I wasn't sure about the consistency with using my high-speed blender, but I've put it out here because we may use it with the green chilies and the canned tomatoes, but I'm not sure yet. Okay, so the next part of the recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of ground cumin in the full recipe. I'm going to try 1 teaspoon of the ground cumin because I'm not sure what that's going to do to it. It also calls for 2 teaspoonfuls of sugar. Now, frankly, the sugar is going to vary depending on the time of year that you're buying tomatoes. If you've got garden fresh ones, if you've got farm market ones, they're going to be sweeter and tastier than the ones that you're going to get in January. And that's why I think her recipe calls for adding the canned tomatoes, because she does say it enriches it. Well, obviously tomatoes in January are going to be hothouse ones, so they're not going to be as tasty, so that's when the canned tomatoes would be really a good additive. But I'm going to try them today anyway as well. And as I said, I'm playing around with some of the recipes, some of the measurements here, because I'm only going to do half of the recipe in case I get to the point where the last ingredient I added I didn't like. So, because I want to keep this aside to see what happens. Now, I'm going to add only 1 teaspoon of sugar instead of the 2 that she's recommended, because again, it's 2 teaspoons of sugar at the beginning. A third one is kept aside for at the end to adjust if you want. And again, this would be in a blender, so I'm fiddling around with some of the ways of mixing it, but just to get the taste. So, as I said, I'm going to taste as I go. Now, adding that cumin did actually enhance the flavors and kind of deepen it. The tomatoes and onions and cilantro and lime juice and garlic, it's pretty nice on its own, kind of fresh tasting, but it just seems a little bit flatter compared to the cumin. One of the commentators on the website said that her husband adds this to his chicken, grilled chicken and that, which it actually would be a great salsa to add to a grilled chicken, but we're looking for the dip kind. So I'm going to add some more of the cumin, because I did like that. I'm going to leave the sugar aside though, because I don't think we need that anymore. The recipe also calls for 1.5 teaspoons of salt. I'm going to leave that to the side until the end, because these tomatoes have salt in them, and because I couldn't find unsalted tomatoes. So that's that added. And this is quite convenient. And I can see that, okay, these are actually quite pureed. They're not, when they say crushed, they do mean crushed. Instead of finely chopped. Actually, it says finely chopped, but to me they look like they're kind of crushed. But that's okay. I mean, this is a flavor enhancer and consistency enhancer too, if you will. So that's half the can. 15 ounces is what the recipe calls for. I'm just adding half because, as I said, I'm only working with half of the recipe, or approximately a little over half. And I'm going to test it again at this point because I have never had green chilies. I don't do Mexican food at home. I would like to learn how to do that, so I'll be looking at her website again in the future to do that. And that also boosts it. And again, as I said, depending on what kind of canned tomatoes you buy, it's going to make a difference, but that really does boost up the dish here. Okay, now the piece de resistance is the green chilies. She pours in a can. And frankly, I only put in 1.5 jalapenos. And without the canned tomatoes, I found it hot enough. But now that I've added the canned tomatoes, I think I could go back and actually add in some more jalapenos. But we'll see what happens when I've added in these green chilies. While we're mixing, I'll just mention that the person who is doing the video for me is my brother James, who has been gracious enough to help me out with this demonstration today. But he gets to taste everything at the end too. Yeah, that's really good. So I'm going to add some more green chilies. These are obviously mild ones, which is why I guess they didn't have any indicator of heat on them. And as you can see, I didn't really have to resort to my blender. So if I had a food processor though, I would have done what the recipe calls for, which is add all of the ingredients except for the canned tomatoes and the green chilies, and only 2/3 of the cumin and 2/3 of the sugar. And I didn't add any salt, so I will actually add some salt and see. I'll add 1/3 of the salt. I'm not a big person for salt, but although those tomatoes said they had salt in them. But if I had a food processor, I would just pop everything into it all at the same time, except for, as I said, the canned tomatoes and the green chilies and so on. It looks so easy on the website doing that, instead of I had to do smaller ingredients in my small chopper. I had to do 1 tomato at a time, so. Yeah, I think that's it. That's the way I like it. So I used all of the ingredients. I may actually play around and add some more of the cumin and some more of the green chilies to my taste. But that's it, and I hope you enjoy, and please visit the website, because if you like spicy food, it's a great resource. Thanks very much from Micah.